Oh yes, so that will be the pressure vessel for Cyclops 2. It'll go to 4,000 meters. It'll be the deepest diving carbon fiber sub ever built. When it goes to 4,000 meters, it'll be the only one out there. I'm going to be the first guy in the sub, so we will see.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Behind the deep blue bubbles of the Titan tragedy, we sense a psychological battle between intellect and intuition going on behind the scenes. What should be done with it? Should we think with our heads or our hearts? And what did Stockton Rush do? We get incredible insight into the identity of the Oceangate CEO through his own admission that he wanted to be like Captain Kirk. And he also used James T. Kirk's famous aphorism about
the final frontier, to
boldly going towards final frontiers on missions.
It's 5-year mission.
As recently as April 2017, he told Fast Company, quote, "I wanted to be the first person on Mars." A few paragraphs later, and bear in mind this is 2017, he talks about the Titan being extremely rare, the only manned sub in the world capable of reaching depths of 4,000 meters that is not owned by the government. He also said that's a rarity that makes the trip to the Titanic such a hot commodity, adding it's already sold out for all 7 of the missions slated to make in its first year. And then did that actually happen? But what I want to do is talk about who this person is, the basic psychology driving this particular individual. If you think about it, boldly going and being brave are traits we admire in heroic captains, but not captains of the Titanic, or for that matter, the Titan. Why not? Because there's reasonable risk based on education, intellect, and intuition. And then there's rash risk-taking, or even brash risk-taking, which is risk-taking that comes with hubris. Simply wanting to associate oneself with a fictional starship captain is hubris. Now, this is a true crime channel, and what we do here, and what we're supposed to be good at, is drawing up psychological profiles, even with very little information. We don't have that problem with Rush. We have more than enough information, including from the CEO himself, to assemble a coherent profile. So let's do that. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the thousands of you who have subscribed over the last few days. And with each successive deep dive, you may have noticed we're getting closer to the whole, hard, cold truth of this story. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So, basic psychology. In the Star Trek mythos, Captain Kirk became Starfleet's youngest starship captain after receiving command of the USS Enterprise for a 5-year mission. Stockton Rush became the youngest jet transport rated pilot in the world at the age of 19. See a comparison there. There is very definitely an insight into Stockton Rush by examining the personality and psychology of his hero, Kirk. And there is also parallel insight by looking into the thing we always look into in true crime when trying to figure out who someone is. We look into their backstory. So let's do both. But let's start with the Kirk mythos. If you want to know who Kirk really was, ask his creator, Gene Roddenberry. Roddenberry wrote in a production memo that Kirk is not afraid of being fallible, but rather is afraid of the consequences to his ship and crew should he make an error of judgment. Does that sound like Stockton Rush? In the myth of the American superhero, Kirk is described as a hard-driving leader who pushes himself and his crew beyond human limits. That sounds a bit closer to him, doesn't it? Roddenberry also wrote, quote, "Kirk is any normal man's insecurities and doubts, but he knows he cannot ever show them, except occasionally in private with ship's surgeon McCoy or in subsequent moments with Mr. Spock, whose opinions Kirk has learned to value so highly." I would like to know who Stockton, Spock, and McCoy were. Perhaps his wife was McCoy, loyal and emotional. But Stockton, it appears, went through a series of Spocks whose criticisms he couldn't abide or wouldn't abide. People like Lockridge, McCullum, Stanley. In fact, in 2018 alone, that's 5 years before the disaster, 38 industry experts co-signed a letter to Rush, urging him to allow his sub to be analysed and classed. He refused. I think Kirk could be hard-headed and stubborn, but he wasn't dogmatic. Dogmatic is to be opinionated even to the point of arrogance. And so what I think we're dealing with here isn't innocent ignorance. I think it's arrogance. After his refusal to change course following the intervention from 38 industry experts, tensions predictably worsened. According to Newsweek, quote, McCullum said his own status as a deep-sea expert meant that many of Oceangate's potential customers contacted him while they were considering buying a ticket to ask whether, they contacted him to say, do you think Titan is safe? And he says he told up to 80 people, no, I don't. I would never get into an unclassed vehicle. His actions sparked a furious response from Rush, according to Newsweek, who apparently called him to remonstrate with him. According to McCullum, Stockton rang him up and he said, you blow the whistle on me and I'll tie you up in legal action. And then he said, you know what, I can dial a journalist faster than you can dial a lawyer. Despite the alleged threats, according to Newsweek, McCullum says that he continued advising, good for him, would-be passengers to avoid the firm, including last week's victim, Hamish Harding. He also advised him. He said, I sat down with Hamish and went through things and showed him the flaws and the correspondence. I tried to show him, don't do this, end quote. Now, as we're going to see in a moment, McCullum wasn't the only one to advise the British billionaire against going on Titan. Let me ask you a question. Is taking risks heroic? If you simply take a risk, does that mean you're a hero? Think about Captain Kirk. Kirk was a rebel. He was also a risk taker, but he was also charismatic. He was also a caring leader. Yet despite his charisma, Kirk was also painfully aware of what he didn't know, which is why he'd quietly consult with Spock or be shaken to his core when McCoy remonstrated with him. The Explorers Club seemed to hold Stockton in high regard, but much of the rest of the submersible industry, folks like James Cameron, cinematographer Al Giddings, and Patrick Leahy, the president of Triton Submarines, did not. So who was right? Well, in the CEO's own words, he said, quote, if you just want to be safe, don't get out of bed. Don't get into your car. Don't do anything. At some point, you're going to take some risk, and it really is a risk-reward question. I think I can do this just as safely by breaking the rules. Those were Stockton Rush's words. And, well, he was wrong. But now let's deal with Stockton Rush's backstory. He was an aviation engineer. Aviation is an arena where one also has to juggle risk and return to some extent. Recently, the movie Top Gun Maverick seemed to emphasize the message, saying, it's not the plane, it's the pilot. Basically, go with your gut. And you can imagine an aviation nut would have watched this movie, loved this movie, and maybe taken notes out of this movie. The trouble with that analogy is the pilot, in this story, the pilot built a defective plane, or sub in this case, which means that the plane is defective because the pilot is defective. And Stockton was a defective pilot. Ironically, in the real world, he was a defective pilot because of his eyesight. The military wouldn't let him through because of vision defects. And he was a defective pilot in terms of being a submersible captain because he simply wouldn't listen to criticism. He thought he knew better. Sheer confidence might apply to dogfights when you have technology backing you up. And somewhere along the line, you've got to take the initiative. But the analogy doesn't translate to the extreme depths of the ocean or those extreme pressures. We've got very idiosyncratic technologies, very specific technologies that can deal with certain situations. But just to emphasize how much the aviation side of things was hardwired into this guy, in 1986 he married Wendy Hollings Whale, that's Whale spelled W-E-I-L, a licensed pilot, a substitute teacher, and the account manager for magazine publishing consultants. Wendy became the director of communications for Oceangate, so she was the one pushing all the PR. He was also a scion. There's a bit of a Murdaugh-esque aspect to this story as well. We kind of get the idea that there's incredible American royalty going on, making up their own rules, super wealthy, their reputation preceding them. Someone who's living on a cloud, effectively, and perhaps one rule for the uber wealthy and another for everyone else. There may also have been this idea of heroism in his wife's family, where great-grandfather and mother were on the Titanic and refused to leave it. And you may say that that is heroic and the stuff of folk tales in that situation, but actually building a ship and operating it when you know it's a death trap, there's nothing heroic about that, and inviting people to go onto it. So if you think about that saying, it's not the plane, it's the pilot. Well, no, it's because of the pilot that you shouldn't trust the plane. So let's rewrite that for the story as don't trust the pilot, don't trust the plane, right? Do you see, in the most basic way, Stockton Rush can be seen as a risk taker. That's how he sees himself. But I don't think that translates to this kind of deep sea diving. Risk taking is something that you don't want to do. And that is how I think he sees himself. That's how others saw him. Even the Smithsonian described him as a daredevil in their article. Others recognized him as an innovator. But more importantly, that's how he saw himself. That's also a fundamental character trait we see in Captain Kirk, but it's not the fundamental trait of Captain Kirk. As alluded to earlier, Kirk is a lot more concerned about his crew and the consequences of his own actions than Stockton Rush. Kirk is also far less of an outlier and a one-man show than Stockton Rush, who seems to kind of go it on his own. Kirk would frequently consult with Spock and McCoy and take their advice. I could be wrong, but my impression of the Frenchman wasn't that he was a Spock or a McCoy, just an enthusiast who was quietly very interested in being able to follow his dream any which way he could. And so he was inclined to go along with whatever the big kahuna said or wanted. According to Patrick Leahy, the president of Triton Submarines, Stockton Rush used his forceful, dominant personality to convince someone like P.H. Paul-Henri Narguillet, he had to have been familiar with the risks, that the risks were worth taking. Leahy said he warned P.H. that, he said, I told him in very candid terms why he shouldn't be out there. And so he understood as well. He said, I believe P.H. thought in some way that by being out there, if he could help these guys avoid a tragedy, it would be good for him to be there. Well, instead he ended up in the middle of one. And this brings us to what I think is a new insight into the circumstances. Is it a coincidence that he died, that Stockton Rush, the CEO, died with a top-tier client like Hamish Harding, a billionaire, on board, also an aviator? Is it a coincidence? The 1996 Everest disaster had a lot of big deals on both expeditions. Charismatic leaders, big shot journalists, rich doctors and lawyers. There was also a battle of the wits where certain climbers alternately blamed their leaders when things didn't happen or they wanted things a certain way, while others put pressure on them to persevere. Caledon Oceanic's Victor Vescovo, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but also a former jet pilot, he warned the same British billionaire, Hamish Harding, against going down in the Titan. Like Stockton Rush, Harding was an aviator and a member of the Explorers Club. And so when Harding was on deck or inside the sub, Stockton likely felt he had an equal on board. And perhaps he felt he needed to prove himself. And he kind of did, because others had warned the billionaire that this craft wasn't certified and thus wasn't a proven entity. And meanwhile, he'd said it was. He said, no. He dismissed that. And so the billionaire went to the ship. And now what is to happen? Is he supposed to say, oh, sorry, we're not going to do this? And so taking it a little bit further, you have kind of a competition. You have one sub-company owner, a guy like Victor, saying, don't go onto that craft, to a billionaire. And the other one saying, guess what, my craft is good to go. And he's just being too conservative. And so what is emerging in that setup is competition, rivalry. And I think this is a vital clue, especially when you're dealing with men. And bear in mind, everyone on board the final fatal mission were men. So I think this is a vital clue to understanding not only Stockton's psychology, but also PH and Hamish, the other men. Why did they go on board as well? I think there's a boys' club thing going on where other guys with subs are essentially in competition saying, don't do it. But if they do succeed, then they're heroes. And isn't that what heroes do?
But me, I choose to run toward my problems and not away from them. Because that's what heroes do.
This year, we saw one after another of those 5 missions ending in failure. We saw that from the behind the scenes on that YouTuber's channel, The Almighty. And Hamish, the billionaire aviator, he was on the last one. When they had all the information, they knew things weren't working. I don't think Stockton was ignorant of the problems or the risks, and I don't think PH or Hamish were either. It wasn't that they didn't know that there were problems. I think what was going on was this idea of trying to be a hero, and that somehow by taking a risk and getting away with it, that would be courage. That would be worthy of Captain Kirk. The irony is that is not what Captain Kirk would do or would want to do. He might endanger himself or go down with his own ship, but he'd never take his crew down with him, and he'd also be aware enough of the structural issues to know it was a fool's gambit in the first place. Was Stockton really going to tell Hamish, after all that aggressive convincing, after all the PR, after all the effort to get him there, to just go home? They were both aviators, and I think part of what was afoot was the one cueing his confidence game off the other, much like Fisher and Hall did in the 1996 Everest disaster. And we know what happened there. Both men killed themselves during what was meant to be and heralded as a blaze of glory. That's ego and hubris. It's not intellect and intuition. It's also very interesting how many references are made to Everest by the CEO. In a CBS interview, Rush acknowledged that it was prudent while exploring the ocean depths to avoid ghost nets, overhangs, and other hazards. But then he said safety concerns could also be a drag on a swashbuckling career. And then he also spoke about how risk pays returns, not only in profits, but also in unforgettable experiences. And then he said this: it really is a life-changing experience, and there aren't a lot of things like that. Rather than spend $65,000 to climb Mount Everest and maybe die, and spend a month living in a miserable base camp, you can change your life in a week. He seemed to be thinking this would be easy and comfortable and cheap, an easy road to riches and heroism. I want to conclude by referencing that article again in GeekWire. It came out in 2021. And, more than 3 years ago, GeekWire confidently predicted that Stockton Rush would learn the lessons from 2018, 2019, and 2020. Did he? The lesson which he knew well in advance of the tragedy was that carbon fiber was a flawed, unworkable design and a kind of design to fail system. Everyone was telling him the same thing. Everyone was telling him that, including his damn ship was telling him in no uncertain terms from those loud cracking noises. But in his hubris, he knew better. And so when he went down at the end of the 2023 season in Mission 5, he wasn't psychologically off track. He was used to ignoring signs and symptoms, critics and criticisms. He knew there were signs, he knew there were risks, but he thought he could get away with it one more time. What is that? That's greed and pride, not principle. There's nothing heroic about that. The Captain Kirk principle is that intellect and intuition are complementary, not competitive. Without intellect, our intuition may drive us into emotional chaos. Without intuition, we risk failing to resolve complex social dynamics and moral dilemmas. For Stockton Rush, it wasn't about intellect or intuition. It wasn't about head stuff or heart stuff. It had all become about the competition. That's an ego construct, which is why he said on camera 5 years ago about the carbon fiber cylinder, he said, that'll be the pressure vessel. It'll go down 4,000 meters. It'll be the deepest diving carbon fiber sub ever built. He's trying to be the best. He's trying to be the hero. He says when it goes down to 4,000 meters, and there's a little haughty vertical tilt of the chin when he says that. He says it'll be the only one out there, and I'm going to be the first guy in the sub, so we'll see. That seems to be a statement bristling with bravado, self-importance, and even challenge. The impression I get from Stockton is that he was all about surfaces and legacies. It was quite superficial. Like most aviators, he was used to the idea of moving over the surface of things, not being inside, not being under the surface. And one wonders if he didn't get the pressure dynamics or engineering side of things wrong, or if he just simply didn't appreciate them. Did he really understand himself? Because he didn't seem to get who Captain Kirk really was either. And so, is this a head thing or a heart thing? I'm inclined to think it was neither. It was an ego thing. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.